It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we left Absalom and Tamar waiting to see what their father, King David, would do regarding how he would avenge Tamar, his daughter, after the rape committed by his son Amnon. Where we saw that David, that he became very angry, but he did nothing. Where Amnon, even after the rape of his sister, he is still the crowned prince of Israel. He's the one in line to inherit the throne of his father David. And so today, in verse 23, we see that 2 years have passed where David has still done nothing to correct Amnon. And this whole time, Absalom hasn't said one word to his father David about Amnon and the rape of his sister, where it said last week in verse 22 that Absalom didn't say anything good or bad about Amnon to David. And it's believed by quite a few people that if David had done something, anything, that Absalom may have not murdered Amnon. But last week, still in verse 22, we were told that Absalom hated Amnon. And now that hatred, along with his desire for vengeance, has had 2 years to grow. But Absalom, he's still holding his tongue and not letting anyone know what's going on in his heart so he can carry out this revenge. So in the same way that Amnon, how he schemed and planned, setting up the scenario to commit a rape, Absalom has schemed and planned and set up his stage to commit a murder. And 2 years is a long time where nobody would be expecting anything to happen, where Absalom has waited patiently until the perfect opportunity arose. And so you can imagine these past 2 years and how much tension there must have been around King David's table. These last 2 years, there's nobody speaking to each other. So this is the typical, perfect, dysfunctional family. But after 2 years, David has to be thinking, or at least hoping, that his family has moved on. But Absalom didn't. So Absalom, he waits for a holiday, sheep shearing, which is like the harvest festival for sheep ranchers. So this is like Thanksgiving, where you invite everyone for the giving of thanks for a prosperous year. And Absalom, he invites his whole family, all the king's sons, and Absalom gives his dad a special invitation to come and to bring all his servants. Because what Absalom is planning is going to be big. It's going to be like a hoedown. It's a grand event, but it seems like he's expecting his father to decline his offer. And his father David, he does decline. And he says that he doesn't want to cause Absalom any excessive burden. Where I just think that David was a busy man, and he's just trying to find a polite way how to bow out without being offensive. But what David is saying is true. When he goes to a function, he would have to travel and bring with him an armed guard of men. So he'd have to have all these bodyguards with him because he's a king. But if you think about it, if all David's sons, they had sheep shearings, and if he had to attend them all, he wouldn't get anything done. Where David was probably invited to all sorts of events where he couldn't be able to attend. And so I think that Absalom, he was aware that his father wouldn't accept his invitation. And so Absalom says, well, if you're not going to go, well, then let my brother Amnon go. And you might think this sounds a bit suspicious. And it does seem that even King David thought it might be a little suspicious because he does question why. Why should Amnon go with you? But this really isn't an unusual request because Amnon is the crown prince. He was David's successor, and he would have often had to have filled in for King David at public events where David couldn't attend. He would be the guest of honor in place of his father, to have someone from the royal family, the future king of Israel. And David, being the permissive father, the buddy father who always indulges his children, he doesn't know how to say no to them. And that's why they're in the trouble that they're in. So David, he lets all his sons go with Absalom. In fact, he may be thinking that they may be a buffer for him, because even if David was slightly suspicious, Absalom surely wouldn't do anything with the whole family there watching. And so I believe David might be thinking, this may be a time of healing. This might be a part of getting all of these things behind us. And there's no reason why David should really be suspecting anything, because it has been 2 long years without a word. And David, he has no idea what's going on in Absalom's heart, just like he didn't know what was going on in Amnon's heart, because David, he doesn't communicate very well with his sons. And here, Absalom was just as calculated as Amnon had ever been, where this is a perfectly choreographed play with all the actors having their parts, where this is going to be the greatest dinner party that any of them have ever attended, the perfect feast, perfectly prepared by Absalom to commit a murder. So this is not like the movie Clue or an Agatha Christie murder mystery, because when this is over, there will be no doubt who killed Amnon. Everyone will know who did it. So at this event, Amnon will be treated like royalty. And there will be drinking. And Absalom's servants, they're told to keep Amnon's cup full, to make his heart merry with wine, because we're going to get that boy drunk, because he's our guest of honor. So let's drink another toast to the boy prince, to the next king of Israel, to my dear brother Amnon, until Amnon is all relaxed, taking away all his suspicions, putting the victim at ease so that he can't see what's coming next. And then when Amnon is more comfortable, and after a few glasses of wine and some clever conversation, where Absalom here, he's still just as sober as he can be, which kind of reminds us of King David with Uriah the Hittite, where he gets him drunk before he kills him. And here, when Absalom kills Amnon, he's not going to use his own sword. He's going to use his servant's sword, just like his father David used the sword of the Ammonites when he killed Uriah the Hittite. So it looks like Absalom took a page out of his father's playbook, where David's boys, they learned a lot from their father David, but not just from his words, but from his actions. Because why use your own sword when you can use somebody else's? And so what we need to remember here is our kids, they're always watching us. And I remember telling my son, Kenan, I know you. I've been watching you my whole life. And he looked at me right back and he says, Dad, I know you. I've been watching you too. And he was right. And I see it in Corbin's life where he does things the way he's seen me do things. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. But what we see here is that the fruit that David is reaping isn't much different than the seeds that he's sown. These are seeds that he has planted. And now the way that Absalom and the way that he talks to his servants after he's commanded them to strike Amnon after he's drunk, he talks to them as if he's righteous, as if he's the good guy, as if he's a hero. And he's acting as if he's like Joshua from the book of Joshua, because he's saying the same kind of phrases that Joshua used. But Absalom is saying them to give his servants the courage to commit this murder, as if this murder is a righteous act. And you got to think, Absalom, he might have been deceiving himself and thinking that this is a righteous act. And Absalom says here, do not be afraid. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. But Absalom is no Joshua here. He's more like Cain in the story of Cain and Abel, because he's about to murder his unsuspecting brother, though his brother should be held accountable, but he's not supposed to be held accountable to Absalom, because Absalom is acting outside of his authority. He has no authority to execute his brother. And even if he thinks his father, David, is wrong, he has no right to take things into his own hand. And at the perfect time, Amnon's unsuspectingly merry with wine. Absalom gives the order, strike Amnon. And Amnon is slain, where at this point the dinner party is pretty much over, but it will be a dinner that no one will soon forget, with all the horror played out right in front of everyone. And you can imagine all the blood and all the screaming. And then with all that chaos, everybody wondering, is Absalom going to kill everyone? Is he going to kill all David's sons, all the heirs to David's throne? Which would not be uncommon in any of the dynasties in these days. Many brothers killed all the rivals to their father's thrones when you're declaring yourself to be the king. And we see that recorded in the Bible. You see it in 2 Chronicles 21. There was Jehoram, Jehoshaphat's son. He killed all of his brothers after he became king. So this is common. And this is what David heard from the first messenger that comes to him in Jerusalem. He hears that all his sons are dead. But back at the sheep shearing with Absalom, all these sons, they couldn't get on their mules fast enough to get out of there, because they're all thinking that they're going to be next. But then in the middle of all this chaos, Absalom, he escapes, because he had this all planned, and he's thinking he's going to get away with it. Because why wouldn't he? His father David did. And so during all the commotion, Absalom flees 80 miles north to his grandfather's kingdom, to his mother's father's, to King Talmai of Geshur, which is located up in Syria by the Sea of Galilee, where he'll be safe, which would have been prearranged. But back in Jerusalem, David, he's torn his robes, and he's laying in the dirt, and he's wailing, because he's been told that all his sons are dead, not one left, that Absalom killed them all. And seeing that David had believed this first report, that tells us right here that David believed that Absalom was capable of doing this kind of an act. David, he didn't put this past him. Where everyone else around David, they also believed that, because they also all tore all their robes too. So nobody put this act past Absalom. And then we see Jonadab show up, Ammon's favorite cousin, David's nephew, where this is the guy that helped Amnon to be able to rape his sister Tamar. And we see here that Absalom, that he didn't invite him to the party, but here he is hanging out with the king, always trying to be in the right place and always trying to get himself ahead. So here, Jonadab, he gives King David his outlook on what he thinks happened. And this is his attempt to try to comfort King David, saying he doesn't believe that everyone's dead, but that only Ammon is dead. And then Jonadab says, as if he knew that Absalom has been determined to kill Ammon since the rape of Tamar. And what I think that it's possible that Jonadab did know this, where he may have had some information regarding this. And so you could kind of wonder why he hadn't said anything till now, where everything about this Jonadab seems to be very shady. But here we see him trying to comfort David, and everything he said, it did prove to be true. And King David's sons, they start to show up one at a time on their mules. And then we see in verse 36, that when all those sons and when they all did return, that they all wept. Because even after all that Amnon had done to their sister Tamar, they all loved Ammon and they were genuinely grieved over his death. And so here, David, he had to have felt partially at fault for Ammon's death because he didn't correct Ammon. Where with his lack of correction, that may have been contributing to Ammon's murder. Where if David had done something, Absalom, he may not have felt free to administer his own kind of justice. But Absalom, he couldn't flee to a city of refuge because there would be no sanctuary for him there because he is a guilty murderer. They would have had to have turned him out or execute him. Because cities of refuge, they're only for the innocent. And that's why he fled up to Geshur, because he'll be safe at Grandpa's. His grandfather would never turn him out. And then we go on, and often the way it is with death, that time can often help heal some of the pain. And that's the way it is for David regarding Amnon's death. Where with time, David stops mourning Amnon, where he's comforted because Amnon's dead and there's nothing he can do about it. But Absalom's still alive, where he's living as a fugitive in exile. And David, he still loves him. And it says that he mourns over Absalom every day because he misses him. Because Absalom was a great son. He's everything you would ever want in a son. He was strong. He was clever, extremely handsome. He had such potential. And now what makes this even more confusing is now Absalom is the heir to the throne, where with Ammon's death, Absalom is now the new crown prince. And as a father, David, he wants to bring Absalom home. But as the king, he's having a hard time doing this because Absalom should be put to death according to the law. Because Absalom didn't commit manslaughter. He committed murder when he took that law into his own hands. And David, he can't show himself to be easy on crime, especially when it comes down to his own family. So he couldn't let Absalom get away with murder because it could cause anarchy in Israel, where everyone starts taking the law into their own hands. And so Absalom, he lives as a fugitive in exile for 3 years. And Joab can see that David longed to bring Absalom home, but David didn't know how to do it. And the people of Israel, they were probably very sympathetic to Absalom for taking the law in his own hands because they could understand that having David as a famous father, and even though that David is the king, that David, he should have done something about Ammon. And for the crime that Amnon committed against his sister, the death penalty wasn't unreasonable because the law, it could have been interpreted that way, where the punishment would have fit the crime. But it just wasn't Absalom's place to execute that sentence. But he would have been the next in line after David to be the one to avenge his sister. So now it's been 5 years since the rape. And it's been 3 years since Amnon's murder. And David here now is about 60 years old. And some people say that Joab, that he probably just wants to bring the crown prince home in case something happened to David because he's getting older. But I think it's because Joab genuinely loves David and that he's trying to help him. But Absalom, he can't come home without permission from David. And David won't do it unless he's convinced it's the right thing to do. Because the king has to uphold the law. And Absalom is guilty of conspiracy and murder. And Absalom, he hasn't respected King David's authority, neither as a father or as a king. And Absalom has had 5 years to change. But all it did is it caused him to grow in bitterness toward his father. And it seems that Joab here, that he may have got this idea from Nathan the prophet, where if you remember Nathan the prophet, how he confronted David by telling him a story, where David actually thought that the story was a real case that was being brought before him as a judge. Where if you remember, Nathan told him that story about the rich man who took a poor man's pet ewe lamb and fed it to a traveler. And where David, he judged that case, where he was really judging himself, where God had created that story to confront David through Nathan the prophet. But this time it isn't God bringing to David a made-up story, but it's Joab. Where Joab, he has fabricated a case, and he makes up his own drama to be acted out in front of David. Where Joab, he hires a wise woman from Tekoa, which is about 7 miles away from Jerusalem. So David, he wouldn't have known her. He would not have seen her anywhere around. And being a wise woman, that means she's a good talker, a woman who can think on her feet, who can play a dramatic role and be convincing, who probably looks something like Aunt Bee from Mayberry, from the Andy Griffith shows. She's your old, sweet grandmother type. And she consents to come at Joab's request to act out this play that Joab has written, pretending to be seeking a judgment in the matter of a murder in her family, which happened among her 2 sons, where one killed the other in a fight between the 2 of them. So she's basically retelling the story of Cain and Abel, where the 2 sons are in a field with no one to separate them, and one strikes the other and he dies. And then she tells David that her whole family has come against her, trying to take her live son away from her to execute him according to the law. Where now the avenger of blood from her family is pursuing her last son, her only son, and demanding her to turn him over to be put to death for the murder of his brother. And this woman from Tekoa, she dresses the part, and she hasn't bathed in days, and she's wearing the clothes of mourning, which would have been sackcloth. And so this dirty old woman, who's as sweet as Aunt Bee, is laying down prostrate on the ground before King David. And she tells him how she's a widow, which means that this son would be her only means of support. But that's not the argument that she's making here. Where her argument to the king is not about her losing her support, but it's that her family, that her branch, that they would lose their last and only heir, that he's the last one left, that is hers and her husband's. He's the last glowing ember, that last glowing coal. And this is a big deal in Israel, to lose a family name from your tribe in Israel. And with this son's death, their family line is extinguished because all the families are to be represented in Israel. Not one of them is to be forgotten. And so she's asking for a pardon for her son because the avenger of blood is coming for him. And he also can't go to a city of refuge because this technically is a murder. And they would turn him over. And so with this woman's case, and what she's asking David to do is to not execute the law in her case, but to let the murderer go free. Because it would be a bigger loss to others who are innocent, who haven't done anything wrong, that will be hurt if he judges that law in exact judgment. And David, he's always a soft touch for sad stories.
To let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,